The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. René Guénon. Translator. Lord Northbourne. Contents. Editorial Note 11. Introduction. 1. Quality and quantity. 2. Materia signata quantitate. 3. Measure and manifestation. 4. Spatial quantity and qualified space. 5. The qualitative determinations of time. 6. The principle of individuation. 7. Uniformity against unity. 8. Ancient crafts and modern industry. 9. The twofold significance of anonymity. 10. The illusion of statistics. And unity and simplicity. 12. The hatred of secrecy. 13. The postulates of rationalism. 14. Mechanism and materialism. 15. The illusion of ordinary life. 16. The degeneration of coinage. 17. The solidification of the world. 18. Scientific mythology and popularization. 19. The limits of history and geography. 20. From sphere to cube. 21. Cain and Abel. 22. The significance of metallurgy. 23. Time changed into space. 24. Toward dissolution. 25. The fissures in the Great Wall. 26. Shanwananisn and sorcery. 27. Psychic residues. 28. The successive stages in anti-traditional action. 29. Deviation and subversion. 30. The inversion of Saiton bowls. 31. Tradition and traditionalism. 32. Neo-spiritualism. 33. Contemporary intuitionism. 34. The misdeeds of psychoanalysis. 35. The confusion of the psychic and the spiritual. 36. Pseudo-initiation. 37. The deceptiveness of prophecies. 38. From anti-tradition to counter-tradition. 39. The great parody, or spirituality inverted. 40. The end of a world. Editorial note. The past century has witnessed an erosion of earlier cultural values as well as a blurring of the distinctive characteristics of the world's traditional civilizations, giving rise to philosophic and moral relativism, multiculturalism, and dangerous fundamentalist reactions. As early as the 1920s, the French metaphysician René Guénon, 1886–1951, had diagnosed these tendencies and presented what he believed to be the only possible reconciliation of the legitimate, although apparently conflicting, demands of outward religious forms. Exoterisms, with their essential core, esotericism. His works are characterized by a foundational critique of the modern world coupled with a call for intellectual reform, a renewed examination of metaphysics, the traditional sciences, and symbolism, with special reference to the ultimate unanimity of all spiritual traditions, and finally, a call to the work of spiritual realization. Despite their wide influence, translation of Guénon's works into English has so far been piecemeal. The Sophia Perennis edition is intended to fill the urgent need to present them in a more authoritative and systematic form. A complete list of Guénon's works, given in the order of their original publication in French, follows this note. The Reign of Quantity gives a concise but comprehensive view of the present state of affairs in the world, as it appears from the point of view of the ancient wisdom, formerly common both to the East and to the West, but now almost entirely lost sight of. The author indicates with his fabled clarity and directness the precise nature of the modern deviation, and devotes special attention to the development of modern philosophy and science, and to the part played by them, with their accompanying notions of progress and evolution, in the formation of the industrial and democratic society which we now regard as normal. Guénon sees history as a descent from form, or quality, toward matter, or quantity, but after the reign of quantity modern materialism and the rise of the masses. 12. The Reign of Quantity. Guénon predicts a reign of inverted quality just before the end of the age, the triumph of the counter-initiation, the kingdom of Antichrist. This text is considered the magnum opus in one Onganon's texts of civilizational criticism, as is Symbols of Sacred Science among his studies on symbols and cosmology and man and his becoming. According to the Vedanta, among his more purely metaphysical works, Ganon often uses words or expressions set off in scare quotes. To avoid clutter, single quotation marks have been used throughout. As for transliterations, Ganon was more concerned with phonetic fidelity than academic usage. The system adopted here reflects the views of scholars familiar both with the languages and Ganon's writings. Brackets indicate editorial insertions, or, within citations, Ganon's editions. Wherever possible, references have been updated and English editions substituted. The present translation is a revised version of that made by Lord Northbourne for the original edition, and the publisher would like to thank Christopher James Northbourne, the translator's son, for his help, encouragement, and permission to work from his father's text. For additional editorial help and proofreading, thanks go to John Ahmed Herlihy, Brian Latham, and Alan Dewar, and for Arabic transliterations, to Professor Shnasr. A special debt of thanks is owed to Cecil Bethel, who revised and proofread the text at several stages and provided the index. Cover design by Michael Bucciano and Gray Henry, based on a drawing of a shell disc preserved in the Peabody Museum, by Ganon's friend and collaborator Anandike Kumaraswamy. Introduction. Since the time when The Crisis of the Modern World was written, the march of events has only served to confirm, all too completely, and all too quickly, the validity of the outlook on the present situation that was adopted in that book, although the subject matter was then dealt with independently of all preoccupation with immediate actuality as well as of any intention toward a vain and barren critique. Indeed, it goes without saying that considerations of that order are worth nothing except insofar as they represent an application of principles to certain particular circumstances, and it may also be noted in passing that if those who have formed the truest judgment of the errors and insufficiencies of the mentality of our times have generally maintained toward them a purely negative attitude, or have only departed from that attitude to propose virtually insignificant remedies quite inadequate to cope with the growing disorder in all domains, it is because a knowledge of true principles has been just as lacking in their case as it has been in the case of those who have persisted in admiring a so-called progress, and in deluding themselves as to its fatal outcome. Besides, even from a purely disinterested and theoretical point of view, it is not enough to denounce errors and to show them up for what they really are, useful though that may be, it is still more interesting and instructive to explain them, that is to say to investigate how and why they have come about, for everything that has any kind of existence, even error, has necessarily its reason for existence. And disorder itself must in the end find its place among the elements of universal order. Thus, whereas the modern world considered in itself is an anomaly and even a sort of monstrosity, it is no less true that, when viewed in relation to the whole historical cycle of which it is a part, it corresponds exactly to the conditions pertaining to a certain phase of that cycle, the phase that the Hindu tradition specifies as the final period of the Kali Yuga. It is these conditions, arising as a consequence of the development of the cycle's manifestation, that have determined its peculiar characteristics, and from this point of view it is clear that the present times could not be otherwise than they actually are. Nonetheless, it is evident that if disorder is to be seen as an element of order, or if error is to be reduced to a partial and distorted aspect of some truth, it is necessary to place oneself above the level of the contingencies of the domain to which that disorder and those errors as such belong. Similarly, in order to grasp the true significance of the modern world in the light of the cyclical laws governing the development of the present terrestrial humanity, it is necessary to be entirely detached from the mentality that is its special characteristic and to avoid being affected by it in the least degree. This is the more evident in that the said mentality implies of necessity, and as it were by definition, a complete ignorance of the laws in question, as well as of all other truths which, being more or less directly derived from transcendent principles, are essentially part of traditional knowledge. All characteristically modern conceptions are, consciously or unconsciously, a direct and unqualified denial of that knowledge. For some time past the author has had it in mind to follow up the crisis of the modern world with a work of a more strictly doctrinal character, in order to set out with more precision certain aspects of the explanation of the present period given in the earlier book, in conformity with the strictly traditional point of view, which will always be adhered to. In the present case it is, for the very reasons already given, not merely the only valid point of view, but it might even be said to be the only point of view possible, since no such explanation could be imagined apart from it. Various circumstances have delayed the realization of that project up till now, but this is beside the point for anyone who is sure that everything that must happen necessarily happens in its due time, and often in ways both unforeseen and completely independent of our will. The feverish haste with which our contemporaries approach everything they do is powerless against this law and can produce only agitation and disorder. That is to say, effects which are wholly negative. But would these people still be moderns if they were capable of understanding the advantages of following the indications given by circumstances that, far from being fortuitous as their ignorance leads them to suppose, are basically nothing but more or less particularized expressions of the general order, an order at the same time both human and cosmic, with which we are compelled to integrate ourselves, either voluntarily or involuntarily? Among the features characteristic of the modern mentality, the tendency to bring everything down to an exclusively quantitative point of view will be taken from now on as the central theme of this study. This tendency is most marked in the scientific conceptions of recent centuries, but it is almost as conspicuous in other domains, notably in that of social organization, so much so that, with one reservation, the nature and necessity of which will appear hereafter, our period could almost be defined as being essentially and primarily the reign of quantity. This characteristic is chosen in preference to any other, not solely nor even principally because it is one of the most evident and least contestable, but above all because of its truly fundamental nature, for reduction to the quantitative is strictly in conformity with the conditions of the cyclic phase at which humanity has now arrived, and also because it is the particular tendency in question that leads logically to the lowest point of the descent that proceeds continuously and with ever-increasing speed from the beginning to the end of a manvantara. That is to say, throughout the whole course of the manifestation of a humanity such as ours. This descent, as has often been pointed out on previous occasions, is but a gradual movement away from the principle, which is necessarily inherent in any process of manifestation. In our world, by reason of the special conditions of existence to which it is subject, the lowest point takes on the aspect of pure quantity, deprived of every qualitative distinction. It goes without saying that this point represents, strictly speaking, a limit, and that is why it is not legitimate to speak otherwise than of a tendency, for during the actual course of the cycle, the limit can never be reached. since it is as it were outside and beneath any existence, either realized or even realizable. We come now to a matter of particular importance which must be established from the outset, both in order to avoid possible misconceptions, and in order to dispose in advance of a possible source of delusion, namely the fact that, by virtue of the law of analogy, the lowest point is as it were the obscure reflection or the inverted image of the highest point, from which follows the consequence, paradoxical only in appearance, that the most complete absence of all principle implies a sort of counterfeit of the principle itself. Something that has been expressed in a theological form in the words Satan is the ape of God. A proper appreciation of this fact can help greatly toward the understanding of some of the darkest enigmas of the modern world, enigmas which that world itself denies because though it carries them in itself it is incapable of perceiving them, and because this denial is an indispensable condition for the maintenance of the special mentality whereby it exists. If our contemporaries as a whole could see what it is that is guiding them, and where they are really going, the modern world would at once cease to exist as such, for the rectification that has often been alluded to in the author's other works could not fail to come about through that very circumstance. On the other hand, since this rectification presupposes arrival at the point at which the descent is completely accomplished, where the will stops turning at least for the instant marking the passage from one cycle to another, it is necessary to conclude that, until this point is actually attained, it is impossible that these things should be understood by men in general, but only by the small number of those who are destined to prepare, in one way or in another, the germs of the future cycle. It is scarcely necessary to say that everything that the author has set out in this book and elsewhere is intended to be addressed exclusively to these few, without any concern for the inevitable incomprehension of the others. It is true that these others are, and still must be for a certain time to come, an immense majority, but then it is precisely in the reign of quantity, and only then, that the opinion of the majority can claim to be taken into consideration at all. However that may be, it is particularly desirable before going any further to apply the principle outlined above to a more limited sphere than that to which it has just been applied. It must serve to dispel any confusion between the point of view of traditional science and that of profane science, especially as certain outward similarities may appear to lend themselves to such confusion. These similarities often arise only from inverted correspondences, for whereas traditional science envisages essentially the higher of the corresponding terms and allows no more than a relative value to the lower term, and then only by virtue of its correspondence with the higher term, profane science on the other hand only takes account of the lower term, and being incapable of passing beyond the domain to which it is related, claims to reduce all reality to it. Thus, to take an example directly connected with the subject of this book, the Pythagorean numbers, envisaged as the principles of things, are by no means numbers as understood by the moderns, whether mathematicians or physicists, just as Principia. Immutability is by no means the immobility of a stone, nor true unity the uniformity of beings denuded of all their qualities. Nonetheless, because numbers are in question in both cases, the partisans of an exclusively quantitative science have not failed to reckon the Pythagoreans as among their precursors, so as not unduly to anticipate developments to follow. Only this much need be said here, namely that this is but one more instance of the fact that the profane sciences of which the modern world is so proud are really and truly only the degenerate residues of the ancient traditional sciences, just as quantity itself, to which they strive to reduce everything, is, when considered from their special point of view, no more than the residue of an existence emptied of everything that constituted its essence. Thus these pretended sciences, by leaving aside or even intentionally eliminating all that is truly essential, clearly prove then oneself incapable of furnishing the explanation of anything whatsoever. Just as the traditional science of numbers is quite a different thing from the profane arithmetic of the moderns, including all the algebraic or other extensions of which the latter is capable, so there is also a sacred geometry no less profoundly different from the academic science nowadays designated by the same name. There is no need to insist at length on this point, for those who have read the author's earlier works, in particular the Symbolism of the Cross, will call to mind many references to the symbolical geometry in question. And they will have been able to see for themselves how far it lends itself to the representation of realities of a higher order, at least to the extent that those realities are capable of being represented in a form accessible to the senses, and besides, are not geometrical forms. Fundamentally and necessarily the very basis of all figured or graphic symbolism, from that of the alphabetical and numerical characters of all languages to that of the most complex and apparently strange initiatic yantras. It is easy to understand that this kind of symbolism can give rise to an indefinite multiplicity of applications. And it should be equally clear that such a geometry, very far from being related only to pure quantity, is on the contrary essentially qualitative. The same can be said of the true science of numbers. For the Principia, numbers, though they must be referred to as numbers by analogy, are situated relatively to our world at the pole opposite to that at which are situated the numbers of common arithmetic. The latter are the only numbers the moderns know, and on them they turn all their attention, thus taking the shadow for the reality, like the prisoners in Plato's cave. The present study is designed to provide a further and more complete demonstration of what, in a very general sense, is the true nature of these traditional sciences, thus bringing into prominence the abyss separating them from the profane sciences, which are something like a caricature or parody of them. This in turn will make it possible to measure the extent of the decadence undergone by the modern mentality in passing from one to the other. It will also indicate, by correctly situating the objects taken into account by each science, how this decadence follows strictly the downward movement of the cycle now being passed through by our humanity. Let it be clear, however, that these are questions nobody can ever claim to treat completely, for they are by their very nature inexhaustible. But an attempt will be made to say enough to enable anyone to draw the necessary conclusions so far as the determination of the cosmic moment corresponding to the present period is concerned. If, however, a proportion of the matters to be dealt with nevertheless continues to appear obscure to some people, that will only be because the point of view adopted fails to conform to their mental habits, and is too foreign to everything that has been inculcated into them by the education they have received and by the environment in which they live. Nothing can be done about this, for there are things for which a symbolical mode of expression properly so called is the only one possible, and which will consequently never be understood by those for whom symbolism is a dead letter. It must also be remembered that a symbolical mode of expression is the indispensable vehicle of all teaching of an initiatic character. But, without even considering the profane world and its evident, and in a sense natural lack of comprehension, it is enough to glance at the vestiges of initiation that still persist in the West in order to see what some people, for lack of intellectual qualification, make of the symbols proffered for their meditation. One may be quite sure that these people, with whatever titles they may be endowed and whatever initiatic degrees they may have received virtually, will never get so far as to penetrate to the real meaning of the smallest fragment of the mysterious geometry of the great architects of the Orient and of the Occident. As the West has just been alluded to, one further remark is called for, however far afield the state of mind that has been specifically designated as modern may have spread, especially in recent years. And however strong may be the hold it has taken and that it exercises ever more completely, at least externally, over the whole world, this state of mind remains nevertheless purely Western in origin. In the West it had its birth, and the West was for a long time its exclusive domain. In the East its influence will never be anything but a westernization. However far that influence may extend in the course of events still to be unfolded, its extension can never be held to contradict what has been said about the difference between the spirit of the East and that of the West, and this difference is none other than that between the traditional spirit and the modern spirit. For it is all too clear that to the extent that a man westernizes himself, whatever may be his race or country, to that extent he ceases to be an Easterner spiritually and intellectually, that is to say from the one point of view that really holds any interest. This is not a simple question of geography, unless that word be understood in a sense other than its modern one, for there is also a symbolical geography. Indeed, in this connection, there is a very significant correspondence between the domination of the West and the end of a cycle. For the West is the place where the sun sets, that is to say where it arrives at the end of its daily journey, and where, according to Chinese symbolism, the ripe fruit falls to the foot of the tree. As to the means whereby the West has come to establish that domination, of which the modernization of a more or less considerable number of Easterners is only the latest and most vexing consequence, it has been made sufficiently clear in the author's other works that these means are based on material strength alone, which amounts to saying that Western domination is itself no more than an expression of the reign of quantity. Thus, from whatever side one looks at things, one is always brought back to the same considerations and constantly sees them verified in all possible applications. There ought not to be anything surprising in this, for truth is necessarily coherent, but that certainly does not mean that truth is cis in one attic, as profane philosophers and scholars all too readily imagine, confined as they are within narrowly limited conceptions to which alone the word systems can properly be applied, and which merely reflect the insufficiency of individual minds left to their own devices. This is so even when the minds in question belong to those conventionally called men of genius, for all the most vaunted speculations of such people are certainly not equal in value to a knowledge of the smallest traditional truth. Enough has been said on that subject in another place, for it has previously been found necessary to denounce the errors of individualism, for that again is one of the characteristics of the modern spirit. Here it may be added that the false unity of the individual, conceived as constituting in himself a complete whole, corresponds in the human order to the false unity of the so-called Atman, the cosmic order. Both the one and the other are merely elements that are regarded as simple from a purely quantitative point of view, and as such are supposed to be capable of a sort of indefinite repetition, which is strictly speaking an impossibility, since it is essentially incompatible with the very nature of things. In fact, this indefinite repetition is nothing but the pure multiplicity toward which the present world is straining with all its might, without, however, being able ever to lose itself entirely therein, because pure multiplicity is situated beneath the level of manifested existence, and represents the extreme opposite of principia unity. The Descending cyclic movement must therefore be considered as taking place between these two poles, starting from unity, or rather from the point closest to unity in the domain of manifestation, relatively to the state of existence envisaged, and gradually tending toward multiplicity, that is to say toward multiplicity considered analytically, and without reference to any principle, for it goes without saying that in the Principia order all multiplicity is synthetically comprehended in unity itself. It might appear that there is, in a sense, multiplicity at the two extreme points, in the same way as there is correlatively, as has just been pointed out, unity on the one side and units on the other, but the notion of inverse analogy applies strictly here too, so that while the Principia multiplicity is contained in metaphysical unity, arithmetical or quantitative units are on the other hand contained in the other and inferior multiplicity. Incidentally, does not the mere possibility of speaking of units in the plural show dearly enough how far removed the thing so spoken of is from true unity? The multiplicity of the lower order is, by definition, purely quantitative. It could be said to be quantity itself, deprived of all quality. On the other hand, the multiplicity of the higher order, or that which can be called so analogically, is really a qualitative multiplicity, that is to say the integrality of the qualities or attributes that constitute the essence of beings and of things. So it can be said that the descent referred to tends away from pure quality toward pure quantity, both the one and the other being limits situated outside manifestation, the one above it and the other beneath, in relation to the special conditions of our world or of our state of existence. These limits are an expression of the two universal principles that have elsewhere been referred to as essence and substance. And they are the two poles between which all manifestation is produced. This is a point that must be explained more fully before going any further, for it provides an indispensable key to the better understanding of the considerations to be developed later in this study. Quality and quantity are fairly generally regarded as complementary terms, although the profound reason for their complementarism is often far from being understood, this reason lying in the polar correspondence referred to toward the end of the introduction to this book. This, the first of all cosmic dualities, is a starting point, for it is situated at the very principle of existence or of universal manifestation, and without it no manifestation would be possible in any mode whatsoever. It is the duality of Purusha and Prakriti according to the Hindu doctrine, or to use another terminology, that of essence and substance. Its two terms must be envisaged as universal principles, and as being the two poles of all manifestation, but, at another level, or rather at a number of different levels, for there are many levels, corresponding to the more or less particularized domains that can be envisaged in the interior of universal manifestation. These two turn 1s can also be used analogically, and in a relative sense to designate that which corresponds to the two principles, or most directly represents theton with reference to a particular more or less limited mode of manifestation. Thus it is that essence and substance can be spoken of in relation either to a world, that is to say to a state of existence determined by certain special conditions, or in relation to a being considered as a separate entity, or even to each of the states of that being, that is to say, to its manifestation in each of the degrees of existence. In this last case, there is naturally a correspondence between what essence and substance represent in the microcosm and what they represent, considered from a macrocosmic point of view, in the world in which the manifestation of the being is situated. In other words, they are then only particularizations of the relative principles that are the determinations of universal essence and substance in relation to the conditions of the world in question. Understood in this relative sense, and especially with reference to particular beings, essence and substance are in effect the same as the form and matter of the scholastic philosophers, but it is better to avoid the use of these latter terms because, doubtless owing to an imperfection of the Latin language in this connection, they only convey rather inaccurately the ideas they ought to express, one and also because they have lately become even more equivocal by reason of the quite different meaning commonly assigned to them in current speech. However that may be, to say that every manifested being is a composite of form and matter amounts to saying that its existence necessarily proceeds simultaneously from both essence and substance, and consequently that there is in each being something corresponding both to the one and to the other of these two principles, in such a way that the being is as it were a resultant of their union, or, to speak more exactly, a resultant of the action exercised by the active principle, essence, on the passive principle, substance, and if consideration is confined to the special case of individual beings, the form and the matter that constitute those beings are respectively identical with what the Hindu tradition designates as nama and rupa. While on the subject of concordances between different terminologies, thus perhaps incidentally enabling some people to translate the explanations given into a language to which they are more accustomed, it may be added that the Aristotelian designations act and potency also correspond to essence and substance. Aristotle's terms are susceptible of a more extended application than are the terms form and matter, but to say that there is in every being a mixture of act and potency comes back to the same thing in the end, for act is that in him by which he participates in essence, and potency is that in him by which he participates in substance, pure. 1. These words translate in a rather unsatisfactory way the Greek terms t and uat, employed in the same sense by Aristotle. These terms will be referred to again later. Act and pure potency could not exist anywhere in manifestation, since they are true equivalents of universal essence and substance. Provided that this is clearly understood, it is possible to speak of the essence and of the substance of our world, that is, of the world. That is the domain of the individual human being, and it can be said that in conformity with the particular conditions that define this world as such, these two principles appear in it under the aspects of quality and of quantity respectively. This may appear evident at first sight so far as quality is concerned, since essence is the principia synthesis of all the attributes that belong to a being and make that being what it is, and since attributes and qualities are really synonymous. And it may be observed that quality, considered as the content of essence, if such an expression be allowable, is not exclusively confined to our world, but is susceptible of a transposition that universalizes its significance. There is nothing remarkable in this, since essence represents the superior principle, but in any such universalization, quality ceases to be the correlative of quantity, for quantity, unlike quality, is strictly linked up with the special conditions of our world. Furthermore, from a theological point of view, is not quality in some way brought into relation with God Himself when His attributes are spoken of, whereas it would be manifestly inconceivable to pretend to assign to Him any sort of corresponding quantitative determination. 2. To this the objection might perhaps be raised that Aristotle ranks quality as well as quantity among his categories, which are only special modes of the being and not coextensive with it. He does so however without affecting the transposition previously mentioned. Indeed he has no need to effect it, for the enumeration of his categories relates only to our world and to its conditions. in such a way that quality cannot be and is not really meant to be understood otherwise than in a sense that is more immediate for us in our state as individuals, the sense in which, as explained earlier, it appears as a correlative of quantity. It is of interest to note on the other hand that the form of the scholastics is what Aristotle calls d and x, and that this latter word is. 2. It is possible to speak of Brahma saguna or qualified, but there can be no possible question of Brahma quantified. Also used to mean species, which is properly speaking a nature or an essence common to an indefinite multitude of individuals. Specific nature is of a purely qualitative order, for it is truly innumerable. In the strict sense of the word, that is to say it is independent of quantity, being indivisible and entire in every individual belonging to the species, so that it is quite unaffected by the number of those individuals, plus or minus not being applicable to it. Moreover, D and C is etymologically the idea, not only in the modern psychological sense, but also in an ontological sense nearer than is ordinarily supposed to the sense in which Plato uses it, for whatever may be the real differences in this connection between the conceptions of Plato and of Aristotle, as so often happens they have been greatly exaggerated by disciples and commentators. The Platonic ideas are also essences. Plato gives expression chiefly to the transcendent aspect and Aristotle to the immanent aspect, but this does not implying 0-1 compatibility, independently of any conclusions to which the systematic spirit may lead. It is only a matter of a difference of level. In any case, they are always considering archetypes or the essential principles of things, such principles representing what may be called the qualitative side of manifestation. Furthermore, the Platonic ideas, under another name and by direct filiation, are the same thing as the Pythagorean numbers, and this shows clearly that although the Pythagorean numbers are, as already indicated, called numbers analogically, they are in no way numbers in the ordinary quantitative sense of the word. They are on the contrary purely qualitative, corresponding inversely on the side of essence to what the quantitative numbers are on the side of substance. Point 3. On the other hand, when Saint Th01 Nas Aquinas says that numera stat ex part materiae, he is speaking of quantitative number, thereby affirming decisively that quantity has an immediate connection with the substantial side of manifestation. The word 3. It may be observed that the name of a being, insofar as it is an expression of its essence, is properly speaking a number understood in this qualitative sense, and this establishes a close link between the oneception of the Pythagorean numbers and consequently that of the Platonic ideas and the use of the Sanskrit word nama to denote the essential side of a being. Substantial is used here because materia in the scholastic sense is not by any means the same as matter as understood by modern physicists, but is properly substance, whether that word be taken in its relative meaning, as when it is put into correlation with forma and referred to particular beings, or whether it be taken, when materia prima is in question, as the passive principle of universal manifestation, that is, as pure potentiality, and so as the equivalent of property in the Hindu doctrine. However, as soon as matter is in question, in whatever sense the word be taken, everything becomes particularly obscure and confused, and doubtless not without reason. For and therefore, while it has been possible to give an adequate account of the relation of quality to essence without developing a long argument, it will be necessary to go more deeply into the relation between quantity and substance in order to present a clear picture of the various aspects assumed by the Western conception of matter even before the advent of the modern deviation in which this word was destined to play so great a part, and it is all the more necessary to do so because this question is in a sense at the very root of the principal subject of this study. For it must be pointed out, in connection with essence and substance, that the scholastics often translate as substantia the Greek word oiagia, which on the contrary means properly and literally essence, and this contributes not a little to the growth of linguistic confusion, hence such expressions as substantial form for instance, this expression being very ill adapted to convey the idea of that which really constitutes the essential side of a being and not its substantial side. 2. Materia. Signata. Quantitate. The scholastics gave the name materia, generally speaking, to what Aristotle had called uat /, but this materia, as has already been said, must in no way be identified with the matter of the moderns. For the idea of matter, complex and even in some ways contradictory as it is, seems to have been as strange to the ancient Westerners as it still is to Easterners. Even admitting that materia can become matter in certain special cases, or rather to be more accurate, that the more recent conception can be made to fit into the earlier one. Materia nevertheless includes many other things at the same time. And it is these other things that must be carefully distinguished from matter, but for the purpose of naming them as a group by some comprehensive term like uat / or materia, we have no better word at our disposal in Western languages than the word substance. In any case, uat / as a universal principle, is pure potency in which nothing is distinguished or actualized, and it constitutes the passive support of all manifestation. It is therefore, taken in this sense, precisely property or universal substance, and everything that has been said elsewhere about property applies equally to uat / thus understood. Point 1 Substance, understood in a relative sense as being that 1. The primary meaning of the word ua. Point 11 is related to the vegetative principle. Here there is an allusion to the root, in Sanskrit mphila, a term applied to property, which is the starting point of manifestation. In this can be seen some connection. Materia signata quantitate 17, which represents analogically the substantial principle and plays its part in relation to a more or less narrowly restricted order of existence, furnishes the term uat / with a secondary meaning, particularly when this term is correlated with d and to designate the two sides, essential and substantial, of particular existences. The scholastics, following Aristotle, distinguish these two meanings by speaking of materia prima and materia secunda, so that it can be said that their materia prima is universal substance and their materia secunda is substance in the relative sense, but, since terms become susceptible of multiple applications at different levels as soon as the relative is considered, what is materia at a certain level can become forma at another, and inversely, according to the more or less particularized hierarchy of the degrees of manifested existence under consideration. In no case is a materia secunda pure potency, although it may constitute the potential side of a world or of a being. Universal substance alone is pure potency, and it is situated not only beneath our world. Substantia, from substare, is literally that which stands beneath, a meaning also attached to the ideas of support and substratum, but also beneath the whole of all the worlds and all the states comprised in universal manifestation. In addition, for the very reason that it is potentiality, absolutely undistinguished and undifferentiated universal substance is the only principle that can properly be said to be unintelligible, not merely because we are not capable of knowing it, but because there is actually nothing in it to be known. As for relative substances, insofar as they participate in the potentiality of universal substance, so far do they also participate in its unintelligibility. Therefore the explanation of things must not be sought on the substantial side, but on the contrary it must be sought on the essential side. Translated into terms of spatial symbolism, this is equivalent to saying that every explanation must proceed from above downward and not from below upward, and this observation has a special relevance at this, which does in fact plunge its roots into that which constitutes the obscure support of our world, substance indeed being in a way the tenebrous pole of existence, as will appear more clearly later on. 18. The reign of quantity. Point, for it immediately gives the reason why modern science actually lacks all explanatory value. Before going further, it should be noted here that the physicists' matter can in no case be anything but a materia secunda, since the physicists regard it as being endowed with properties, on the nature of which they are incidentally not entirely in agreement, so that their matter is not potentiality and indistinction and nothing else. Besides, moreover, as the physicists' conceptions relate to the sensible world and do not go beyond it, they would not know what to do with the conception of a materia prima. Nonetheless, by a curious confusion, they talk all the time of inert matter, without noticing that if it were really inert it would have no properties and would not be manifested in any way, so that it could have no part in what their senses can perceive. Nevertheless they persist in pronouncing everything that comes within range of their senses to be matter, whereas inertia can actually only be attributed correctly to materia prima, because it alone is synonymous with passivity or pure potentiality. To speak of the properties of matter while asserting at the same time that matter is inert is an insoluble contradiction, and, by a strange irony, modern scientism, which claims to eliminate all mystery, nonetheless appeals in its vain attempts at explanation only to the very thing that is most mysterious in the popular sense of the word, that is to say most obscure and least intelligible. The question now arises, after setting aside the supposed inertia of matter as being really no more than an absurdity, whether matter, endowed as it is with the more or less defined qualities that enable it to be manifested to our senses, is the same thing as the materia secunda of our world as understood by the scholastics. Doubt will at once arise as to the validity of any such assimilation, if it be noted that the materia secunda in question, if it is to play a part in relation to our world analogous to that played by materia prima, or universal substance in relation to all manifestation, must in no way be manifested in this world itself, but can only serve as support or root to whatever is manifested therein, and that in consequence sensible qualities cannot be inherent in it, but on the contrary must proceed from forms implanted in it, and this again amounts to saying that anything that is quality must necessarily be referred to materia signata quantitate. 19. Essence. Here a new confusion makes its appearance. Modern physicists, in their efforts to reduce quality to quantity, have arrived by a sort of logic of error to the point of confusing the two, and thence to the attribution of quality itself to their matter as such, and they end by assigning all reality to matter, or at least all that they are capable of recognizing as reality, and it is this that constitutes materialism, properly so called. Nevertheless, the materia secunda of our world cannot be devoid of all determination, for if it were so it would be inseparable from the materia prima itself in its complete indistinction. Neither can it be a sort of generalized materia secunda, for it must be determined in accordance with the special conditions of this world, in such a way that it can effectively play the part of substance in relation to this world in particular, and not in relation to anything else. The nature of this determination must then be specified, and this is what St. Thomas Aquinas does when he defines this particular materia. Secunda as materia signata quantitate, quality is therefore not inherent in it and is not that which makes it what it is, even if quality is considered only in relation to the sensible order, its place is taken by quantity, which thus really is ex part materia. Quantity is one of the very conditions of existence in the sensible or corporeal world. It is the condition that belongs most exclusively of all to that world. Therefore, as might have been expected, the definition of the materia secunda in question cannot concern anything other than this world, but it must concern this world as a whole, for everything, that exists in this world is necessarily subject to quantity. The definition given is therefore fully sufficient, and there is no need to attribute to materia secunda, as has been done to modern matter, properties that can in no way really belong to it. It can be said that quantity, regarded as constituting the substantial side of our world, is as it were its basic or fundamental condition, but care must be taken not to go too far and attribute to it an importance of a higher order than is justifiable, and more particularly not to try to extract from it the explanation of this world. The foundation of a building must not be confused with its superstructure. While there is only a foundation, there is still no building, although the foundation is indispensable to the building. In the same way, while there is only 20 the reign of quantity, there is still no sensible manifestation, although sensible manifestation has its very root in quantity. Quantity, considered by itself, is only a necessary presupposition, but it explains nothing. It is indeed a base, but nothing else, and it must not be forgotten that the base is by definition that which is situated at the lowest level, so that the reduction of quality to quantity is intrinsically nothing but a reduction of the higher to the lower, and some have very rightly attributed this very character to materialism. To claim to derive the greater from the lesser is indeed one of the most typical of modern aberrations. One further question presents itself. We meet with quantity under diverse modes, and in particular as discontinuous quantity, which is nothing but number 2, and as continuous quantity, which is principally represented by spatial and temporal magnitudes. Among all these modes, which is the one that can most accurately be called pure quantity? This question has its importance, all the more so because Descartes, whose place is at the starting point of many, specifically modern philosophical and scientific conceptions, tried to define matter in terms of extension, and to make his definition the principle of a quantitative physics, which, though not yet quite materialism, was at least mechanism, and it might be tempting to draw the conclusion that extension, as being directly inherent in matter, represents the fundamental mode of quantity. On the other hand, St. Thomas Aquinas, when he says that numera stat ex part materiae, seems rather to suggest that number constitutes the substantial basis of this world, and therefore that it is number that must properly be looked on as pure quantity, and the attribution of a basic character to number is in perfect agreement with the fact that in the Pythagorean doctrine number is taken, by inverse analogy, as the symbol of the essential principles of things. It should be. 2. The pure idea of number is essentially that of whole number, and it is evident that the sequence of the whole numbers constitutes a discontinuous series. All the extensions that have been applied to this idea, and that have given rise to the notions of fractional numbers and incommensurable numbers, are real alterations, and only in fact represent the efforts that have been made to reduce as far as possible the intervals in the numerical discontinuity, so as to lessen the imperfection inherent in the application of number to continuous magnitudes. Materia signata quantitate 21. Noted too that the matter of Descartes is no longer the materia secunda of the scholastics, it is on the other hand an exan 1 ple, perhaps the earliest in point of date, of the modern physicists' matter. Although Descartes' notion did not then include all that his successors were gradually to incorporate in it in order to arrive at the most recent theories of the constitution of matter. There is therefore reason to suspect that there may be some error or confusion in the Cartesian definition of matter, and that some element not of a purely quantitative order must have slipped into it at that stage, perhaps unsuspected by its originator. The nature of his error will be made clear in Chapter 4, where we shall see that extension, although it is obviously quantitative in character, like everything else belonging to the sensible world, cannot be regarded as pure quantity. It may also be observed that the theories which go farthest in the direction of a reduction to the quantitative are generally atomistic. In one way or another, that is to say, they introduce discontinuity into their notion of matter in such a way as to bring it into much closer relation to the nature of number than to that of extension. And the very fact that the material from which bodies are formed cannot in any case be conceived otherwise than as extended is never anything but a source of contradictions in all atomism. Another cause of confusion is the habit that has grown up of considering body and matter as nearly synonymous. Actually, bodies are in no sense materia secunda, which is not met with anywhere in the manifested existences of this world, bodies only proceeding from it as from their substantial principle. But number, like materia secunda, is never perceived directly and in a pure state in the corporeal world. And it is number that must without doubt be considered primarily as constituting the fundamental mode in the domain of quantity. The other modes of quantity are only derived from number, that is to say, they are so to speak only quantity by virtue of their participation in number, and this is implicitly recognized whenever it is maintained, as in fact it always is, that everything quantitative must be expressible in terms of number. In these other modes, even when quantity is the predominant element, it always appears as more or less mixed with quality. Thus it is that the conceptions of space and of time, despite the efforts of modern mathematicians, can never be 22 the reign of quantity, exclusively quantitative, unless indeed it be accepted that they must be reduced to entirely empty notions, without contact with any kind of reality. And is not the science of today in actual fact made up to a large extent of such empty notions, purely conventional in character and without the least effective significance? This last question must be more fully dealt with, especially so far as it concerns the nature of space, for this aspect of the question is very closely connected with the principles of geometrical symbolism, while at the same time it provides an excellent example of the degeneration that traditional conceptions must undergo in order to become profane conceptions. The procedure will be to examine first of all how the conception of measure, the very foundation of geometry, can be transposed, in a traditional sense, in such a way as to give it a significance quite other than that which modern scientists attach to it, for they only see in measure a means for getting as near as they can to their topsy-turvy ideal, which seeks to bring about by degrees the reduction of all things to quantity. 3. Measure and manifestation. The use of the word matter, except where modern conceptions are being specially examined, will henceforth be avoided for preference, and it must be understood that the reason for this lies in the confusions to which it inevitably gives rise, since it is impossible to use the word without at once evoking, even in those who are aware of the different meaning attached to the word by the scholastics, the idea of that which modern physicists call matter. For this last acceptation is the only one that holds good in current language. The idea in question, as we have seen, is not met with in any traditional doctrine, whether it be Eastern or Western. This indicates at least that, even to the extent that it might legitimately be admitted, after clearing it of certain incongruous and even flatly contradictory elements, it contains nothing that is really essential and is related only to one highly particularized way of looking at things. At the San Juan time, since the idea is very recent, it cannot be implicit in the word itself, which is far older, so that the original meaning of the word must be quite independent of its modern meaning. It must, however, be admitted that the true etymological derivation of this word is very difficult to determine, as if a more or less impenetrable obscurity one must inevitably envelop everything that has to do with matter, and it is scarcely possible in this connection to do more than distinguish certain conceptions associated with its root. This will be by no means without interest, although it is impossible to specify exactly which of the various conceptions is the closest to the primitive meaning of the word. 24. The reign of quantity. The connection that seems to have been noticed most often is that which relates materia to matter, and this fits in well with the idea of substance as the passive principle and as symbolically feminine. It can be said that Prakriti plays the maternal part in relation to manifestation, and Purusha the paternal, and the same is true at all the levels at which a correlation of essence and substance can be envisaged. Analogically, one on the other hand, it is also possible to relate this same word materia to the Latin verb materi, to measure, and it will appear later that there is in Sanskrit a form still closer to it. Measure, however, implies determination, and determination cannot be applied to the absolute intermination of universal substance, or the materia prima, but must rather be related to some other more restricted notion, a point we propose to now examine more closely. Ananda K. Kumaraswamy has said on this subject: for everything that can be conceived or perceived, in the manifested world, Sanskrit has only the expression namarupa, the two terms of which correspond to the intelligible and the sensible, considered as two complementary aspects referred respectively to the essence and to the substance of things. 2. It is true that the word matra, which literally means measure, is the etymological equivalent of materia, but that which is thus measured is not the physicist's matter, it is the possibilities of manifestation inherent in the spirit, Atma. Point 3. 1. This also agrees well with the original meaning of the word ua.n, which was given above. The plant is, so to speak, the mother of the fruit that comes forth from it and is nourished from its substance, but the fruit is only developed and ripened under the vivifying influence of the sun being thus in a sense its father. And as a result the fruit itself is symbolically assimilated to the sun by coessentiality. If it be permissible to use this expression, as may also be understood by reference to explanations given elsewhere of the symbolism of the adityas and other similar traditional notions. To these two terms, intelligible and sensible, used in this way as correlatives, properly belong to the language of Plato. It is well known that the intelligible world is for Plato the domain of ideas or of archetypes, which, as we have seen, are actually essences in the proper sense of the word, and, in relation to this intelligible world, the sensible world, which is the domain of corporeal elements and proceeds from their combinations, is situated on the substantial side of manifestation. 3. Notes on the Katha Upanidhi, New Indian Antiquary, Bombay, 470, 1938 pt. 2. Measure and Manifestation 25. The idea of measure, brought in this way into direct relation with manifestation itself, is very important, and is n1 Oriover far from being peculiar to the Hindu tradition, which Kumarese 1-1y had particularly in view here. It can indeed truthfully be said that the idea is found in all the traditional doctrines in one form or another. And, while it is naturally impossible to attempt to enumerate all the relevant concordances that could be pointed out, enough can perhaps be said to justify the statement, and at the same time to clarify, as far as it is possible to do so, the symbolism of measure, which plays so important a part in certain initiatic forms. Measure, understood in the literal sense, is principally concerned with the domain of continuous quantity, that is to say, it is concerned most directly with things that have a spatial character, for time, though no less continuous than space, can only be measured indirectly, by as it were attaching it to space through one nivament as intermediary, thus establishing a relation between the two. This amounts to saying that measure is specifically concerned either with extension itself, or with what is conventionally called the matter of physics, by reason of the character of extension that this last necessarily possesses, but this does not mean that the nature of matter can, as Descartes claimed, be reduced simply to extension and nothing more. In the first case, measure is correctly said to be geometrical; in the second case, it would more usually be called physical in the ordinary sense of the word, but in reality the second case becomes merged in the first, for it is only by virtue of the fact that bodies are situated in extension and occupy a certain defined part of it that they are directly measurable, whereas their other properties are not susceptible of measure one-ment, except to the degree that they can in some way be related to extension. We are at this point, as was foreseen, a long way from the materia prima, which in its absolute indistinction, can neither be measured in any way nor be used as a measure of anything else, but it is necessary to inquire whether the notion of measure be not more or less closely linked with whatever it is that constitutes the materia secunda of our world, and it turns out that a linkage exists through the fact that the materia secunda is signata quantitate. Indeed, if measure directly concerns extension and what is contained therein, it is only by the quantitative aspect of this extension that measure is made possible. 26. The reign of quantity. But continuous quantity as such is, as explained, only a derived mode of quantity, that is to say it is only quantity by virtue of its participation in pure quantity, which in its turn is inherent in the materia secunda of the corporeal world, and besides, just because continuity is not pure quantity, measure always carries a certain degree of imperfection in its numerical expression, as the discontinuity of number makes a fully adequate application of number to the determination of continuous magnitudes impossible. Number is indeed the basis of all measurement, but, so long as number is considered by itself, there can be no question of measurement, for measurement is the application of number to something else. An application of this kind is always possible within certain limits, but only after taking into account the inadequacy just referred to, and this applies to everything subject to the quantitative condition, in other words, to everything belonging to the domain of corporeal manifestation. Only, and here the idea expressed by Kumarese Watney recurs, it must be most carefully noted that, despite certain prevalent misuses of ordinary language, quantity is never really that which is measured, it is on the contrary that by which things are measured, and furthermore, it can be said that the relation of measure to number corresponds, in an inversely analogical sense, to the relation of manifestation to its essential principle. It is evident that in order to carry the idea of measure beyond the Limits of the corporeal world, it must be analogically transposed. The manifestation of the possibilities of the corporeal order takes place in space, so that space may be made use of to represent the whole domain of universal manifestation, which otherwise would not be representable. Thus the idea of measure, when it is applied to this comprehensive domain, is an essential part of the spatial symbolism that is so frequently employed. Fundamentally then, measure is an assignation or a determination necessarily implied in all manifestation, in every order and under every mode. As a determination, it naturally conforms to the conditions of each state of existence, and it is even in a certain sense identified with those conditions themselves, it being truly quantitative only in our world. Since quantity, like space and time, is no more than one of the special conditions of corporeal existence. But there is in every world a measure and manifestation 27. Determination that can be symbolized for us by the quantitative determination we know as measure, because it is the determination corresponding in other worlds to measure in our own, in accordance with the difference of conditions in each, and it can be said that through this determination these other worlds, together with all that they contain, are realized or actualized as such, since it is inherent in the very process of manifestation. Coomaraswamy remarks that the Platonic and Neoplatonic concept of measure, J. Itpov, agrees with the Indian concept. The non-measured is that which has not yet been defined, the measured is the defined or finite content of the universe, that is, of the ordered universe. The non-measurable is the infinite, which is the source both of the indefinite and of the finite, and remains unaffected by the definition of whatever is definable, that is to say by the realization of the possibilities of manifestation which it carries in itself. It is clear from this that the idea of measure is intimately connected with that of order, in Sanskrit rita, and order is in turn related to the production of the manifested universe, the universe being, according to the etymological meaning of the Greek word koojl, a production of order out of chaos, the latter being the indefinite in the Platonic sense, and the cosmos the definite point for the production of order is also assimilated in all traditions to an illumination. The fiat lux of Genesis, the chaos being symbolically identified with darkness, chaos is the potentiality from which as starting point manifestation will be actualized, that is to say, it is in effect the substantial side of the world, which is therefore described as the tenebrous pole of existence, whereas essence is the luminous pole, since it is the influence of essence that illuminates the chaos in order to extract from it the cosmos. All this is in agreement with the interrelation of the different meanings implicit in the Sanskrit word shrishti, which designates the production of manifestation, and for the Sanskrit word rita is related by its root to the Latin ordo, and it is scarcely necessary to point out that it is related even more closely to the word rite. A rite is, etymologically, that which is accomplished in conformity with order, and which consequently imitates or reproduces at its own level the very process of manifestation. And that is why, in a strictly traditional civilization, every act of whatever kind takes on an essentially ritual character. 28. The reign of quantity contains simultaneously the idea's expression, conception, and luminous radiation. 5. The solar rays make apparent the things they illumine so that they become visible, the rays thus being said symbolically to manifest them, and if a central point in space is considered together with the radii emanating from it, it can also be said that these radii realize space by causing it to pass from virtuality to actuality, and that their effective extension is at any instant the measure of the space realized. These radii correspond to the directions of space properly so called, these directions being often represented by the symbolism of hair, a similar symbolism being used in connection with the solar rays. Space is defined and measured by the three-dimensional cross, and in the traditional symbolism of the 7 solar rays, 6 of those rays arranged in 2 opposite pairs form the cross, while the 7th ray, the ray that passes through the solar gate, can only be represented graphically by the center itself. All this is perfectly coherent, and is linked together as rigorously as could be, and it may be added that, in the Hindu tradition, the 3 steps of Vishnu, whose solar character is well known, measure the 3 worlds, which amounts to saying that they effectuate the totality of universal manifestation. We know too that the 3 elements that constitute the sacred monosyllable Om are designated by the term Maitra, showing that they also respectively represent the measure of the 3 worlds, and by the mediation of these Maitras, the being realizes in itself the corresponding states or degrees of universal existence, and so becomes itself the measure of all things. 6. The Sanskrit word Maitra has as its exact equivalent in Hebrew the word Middah, and the Middoth are assimilated in the Kabbalah to the divine attributes, by which God is said to have created the worlds, and this conception is also brought directly into relation with the symbolism of the central point and the directions of space. 7. In this connection the biblical statement may be recalled, according to which God has arranged all things by measure, and 5 cfak kumare swami, Ibid. 6 cf man and his becoming according to the Vedanta, chapter 17. 7 cf the symbolism of the cross, chapter 4. Measure and manifestation 29. Number and weight, 8. These 3 categories clearly represent diverse modes of quantity, but they are only literally applicable as such to the corporeal world and to nothing else, though by an appropriate transposition they may nevertheless also be taken as an expression of universal order. The same is also true of the Pythagorean numbers, but the mode of quantity that is primarily associated with measure, namely, extension, is the mode that is most often and most directly brought into relation with the process of manifestation itself, by virtue of a certain natural predominance of spatial symbolism in this connection, arising from the fact that space constitutes the field, in the sense of the Sanskrit kshetra, within which corporeal manifestation is developed, corporeal manifestation being inevitably taken as the symbol of the whole of universal manifestation. The idea of measure immediately evokes the idea of geometry. For not only is every measurement essentially geometrical as we have already seen, but also geometry itself can be called the science of measurement, but it goes without saying that geometry understood primarily in a symbolic and initiatic sense is here in question. Profane geometry being merely a degenerate vestige thereof, deprived of its original deep significance, which is entirely lost to modern mathematicians. Such is the essential foundation of all conceptions, in which divine activity, conceived as producing and ordering the worlds, is assimilated to geometry, and consequently also to architecture, for the two are inseparable. 9. And it is known that these conceptions have been preserved and transmitted in uninterrupted succession from Pythagoras in 1, which was itself only an adaptation, and not really original, down to what still remains of the Western initiatic organizations. However unconscious these organizations may now be of the nature of the conception in question. Related to this very point is Plato's statement that God geometrizes always. Adu 8 eo.